course, very modern apes, it's time to talk about this guy and how I was right all along. Kind of. This is TM266, otherwise known as Tomai or Sahelanthropus tchadensis, and it is considered by most to be the oldest hominin in the fossil record at approximately 7 million years. Sahelanthropus tchadensis is a controversial hominin for many reasons, and I have discussed one of those reasons in the past on my channel, although I have since taken that video down since new information has come to light, and I also feel like the audio was bad in that video, like most of my older videos. There is a lot to say about this hominin, and I want to cover most of it in its deepest minutiae once I get to the next video in the Wild Tale of Human Evolution, which happens to be on Sahelanthropus tchadensis. But I wanted to devote an entire video to this particular paper because I feel a bit vindicated by it and also a bit perplexed by it, and I want to talk about sort of both of those reasons. We'll be going over the deepest depths of the minutiae with regard to Sahelanthropus tchadensis and its paleo environment, its discovery, sort of the geochronology, the dating that went into figuring out how old this thing is, and sort of the drama around the individuals involved down the line. Today we're going to be talking about a very specific recent paper, though, from this year of our Lord 2022 by Daver et al. And also Frankie is involved, and it's that paper that I've brought up many times on this channel. And that is this paper, Postcranial Evidence of Late Miocene Hominin Bipedalism in Chad. There's Daver, however you say it, and Frankie, as well as many others who were involved. And right from the title, you can see how this was a bit of a bombshell, especially in light of the previous paper, the most recent one that came out on the topic, which again, I've covered on this channel before, which is titled Nature and Relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis by Machiavelli et al. To summarize very briefly before we get into this quibble is on the basis of some new postcranial material. Basically, everything we've known about Sahelanthropus tchadensis until about 2 years ago was rooted in a single skull, a single cranium. But postcrania came to light, so again, material below the neck, and we have two opposing opinions on what one aspect of this postcrania actually means. What does the femur say about the locomotor style of Sahelanthropus tchadensis? This paper that you're looking at on your screen right now from 2 years ago is arguing that on the basis of new postcranial or below the head material, Sahelanthropus tchadensis is not a biped. And this next paper that we're looking at today that just came out is arguing that no, it is in fact a biped on the basis of the femur. And I have thoughts. I held off talking about this paper until I could have a lab meeting and get a feel for how my department is feeling about this paper because it created a lot of waves, especially on Twitter. The teams that worked with Machiavelli et al. Versus the teams that worked with Guy and Daver do not seem to like each other, and they seem to obviously have very different interpretations of this particular femur. The femur isn't much, but it is something, so we're gonna get there. First, let's talk a little bit about Sahelanthropus tchadensis in general, what it is, how old it is, etc., etc. Sahelanthropus tchadensis is probably a hominin that lived around 7 million years ago in Chad. This is very different from some of the later hominins, which seem to be populating East Africa and also South Africa. We don't really find much in the way of Central Africa, except for Sahelanthropus tchadensis and maybe a handful of Australopith material that may be unique from Australopithecus afarensis, and it may not be. But boy, what a splash French paleontologist Brunet and colleagues made when they turned up with not just a hominin, but the oldest hominin in Central Africa of all places, around Lake Chad and what would have previously been Mega Lake Chad. This expedition by Brunet and colleagues was in the early 2000s, so while we knew about Australopithecus anamensis, its range wasn't very well known. As the early Australopith, this is the link to the earlier Miocene at this time. We had nothing really on Ardipithecus ramidus, which lived 4.4 million years ago, and Aurorantuganensis was really just coming to light, living around 6 million years ago. Sahelanthropus tchadensis at 7 million years would be the oldest asserted hominin to date. This cranium was sort of the star of the show and had to be reconstructed, as you can see, because it was heavily distorted. It was in like a million different pieces, although it was held together. That being said, though, it was twisted around and had clearly been sort of manipulated by the processes of fossilization. So much went into reconstructing it in an anatomically feasible way. And the main means by which this was done was by using landmarks on the skull itself. The first paper to come out on the reconstruction, at least with regard to landmarks, is what you can see now. Virtual cranial reconstruction of Sahelanthropus tchadensis, and look who's on the paper, Frank Guy. His name is going to continue to come up. And these guys say previous research in tchadensis manala, 266 fossiliferous locality, unearthed a nearly complete cranium, 3 mandibular fragments, and several isolated teeth. So these are our 5 individuals present at the site. And they note that this thing was pretty much destroyed, so here we present a detailed virtual reconstruction of the TM266 cranium that corrects these distortions. The reconstruction confirms the Sahelanthropus tchadensis is a hominid. Here they mean hominin. It's only been somewhat recent that the vernacular has changed here, and is not more closely related to the African great apes as compared to hominids. Analysis of the basic cranium further indicates that Sahelanthropus tchadensis might have been an upright biped, suggesting that bipedalism was present in the earliest known hominins and probably arose soon after the divergence of chimpanzee and human lineages. So this paper is particularly interesting to me because when they were doing this virtual reconstruction, they actually had sort of a hominin morph or hominin general shape, as well as a chimpanzee general shape and a gorilla general shape, to see how that impacted the shape of the cranium, right? How the cranium looked. And very specifically, the location of the foramen magnum with relation to these 3 general shape spaces. The foramen magnum, as you will hopefully recall if you've been on this channel for a while, is the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord exits and goes out to the rest of the body. In bipeds, things with an upright posture, the foramen magnum is pushed forward directly underneath the skull so that it can sit on top of the vertebral column and allow for this efficient sort of bipedal locomotion, holding the body upright. In chimpanzees and gorillas, this foramen magnum is shifted backwards, more to the back or posterior portion of the skull, because the spinal cord comes out at an angle to accommodate their quadrupedalism, their knuckle walking. They can still walk upright, but they're obviously less efficient at it than we are. Australopiths, as you have seen before on this channel, also have an intermediate foramen magnum that looks more like the human condition than the quadrupedalism condition, because that's kind of how you can chart the emergence of bipedality in the fossil record, isn't it? From a generalized Miocene ape living approximately 7 million years ago, this foramen magnum should be more backwardly placed, and in these animals, as they sort of take on this upright posture and bipedal locomotion on 2 legs instead of 4, that foramen magnum should, in theory, shift forward. And this is precisely what we see. The question is, when did it shift? Because it's already pretty far forward by the time we reach the Australopiths. In that paper that I just had on the screen, Guy and colleagues intentionally tried to recreate the Sahelanthropus cranium in both a more hominin-looking shape space, a more pan or chimpanzee-looking shape space, and a more gorilla-looking shape space. And it turned out, and these were their words, when they tried to make this thing look more like a chimpanzee or more like a gorilla, at least in the sense of the location of the foramen magnum, so they tried to recreate it, reconstruct it so that this hole was more posterior, the shape of the overall cranium became anatomically unfeasible. The only way that this thing could come out, at least with regard to where the foramen magnum is in relation to other landmarks, things like the occipital condyles and the rest of the basic cranium, ended up with this thing looking like a hominin, with a forwardly placed foramen magnum. This doesn't necessarily suggest bipedalism, but it certainly suggests upright posture, which is a prerequisite for bipedalism, and generally, at least in hominins and in apes, these 2 things are pretty heavily linked to one another. Guy is on a paper later that year in 2005 that actually looks at the shape of the cranium, not just with regard to the foramen magnum, but in regard to the face as well. They say here we compare the reconstruction of TM266 with the crania of African apes, humans, and several Pliocene hominids. These results not only confirm that TM266 is a hominin, but also reveal a unique mosaic of characteristics. And they note that it shares many primitive features with chimpanzees, but is overall most similar to Australopiths, particularly in the basic cranium. This confirms again kind of what we just talked about. Now they are using the reconstruction that we just mentioned, but again, it's anatomically unfeasible, at least according to those authors, to reconstruct it in a non-hominin-like fashion. That is to say, when you reconstruct it in the most anatomically feasible way, it looks like a hominin. They go on to say it's distinctive in having a combination of a short subnasal region associated with the vertical upper face that projects substantially in front of the neurocranium. It's like prognathic, right? Further research is needed to determine the evolutionary relationship between Sahelanthropus and the known Miocene and Pliocene hominins. So this is very interesting. Guy is, of course, invested in Sahelanthropus tchadensis, which is important to keep in mind because he is an author on the paper that we're going to be going over shortly. In addition to the basicranium and the foramen magnum being hominin-like, it's also argued that this thing is a hominin on the basis of the nuchal plane and on the basis of the reduced canines, which is one of the first things that happens in hominin evolution if Ardipithecus is anything to go off of. Now, these characteristics are pretty diagnostic of hominins to the exclusion of other apes, other Miocene apes at that time period and indeed further in time, at least as far as we know now. So, with the cranium kind of established, what is this new paper about? Well, this new paper was published in Nature, and if you will remember, for a long time it was in prepress, and I covered it with sort of a word of caution, like we need to make sure that this thing actually makes it through peer review before we really give it any credence. But now it has gone through peer review, so let's see what they found. Now, first I need to tell you, unfortunately, this is not open access, so I cannot go through this thing sentence by sentence. I will pick out important parts, I will link it in the description, and if you want to go to a science hub to see it for yourself, you can do that, but we will be going through the pictures, if you will, together, because those are really going to be the most informative. Seeing it for yourself, seeing what they actually did, rather than just taking their word for it. So first, let's read the abstract. I read it in another video, but we're going to go ahead and do it again. Postcranial evidence of late Miocene hominin bipedalism in Chad. Bipedal locomotion is one of the key adaptations that defines the hominin clade. Evidence of bipedalism is known from the postcranial remains of a late Miocene hominin as early as 6 million years ago. They're talking about Aurora and tchadensis, but bipedality of Sahelanthropus tchadensis was hitherto inferred about this 7 million years ago in Chad based off the cranial evidence. They're talking about the foramen magnum there, the location of the foramen magnum. Here we present postcranial evidence of the locomotor behavior of Sahelanthropus tchadensis with new insights into bipedalism at an early stage of hominin evolutionary history. The original material was discovered at the locality of TM266 of the Taurus Manala fossiliferous area and consists of one left femur and two right and left ulnae. The morphology of the femur is most parsimonious with habitual bipedality, and the ulnae preserve evidence of substantial arboreal behavior. Taken together, these findings suggest that hominins were already bipeds around 7 million years ago, but also suggest that arboreal clambering was probably a significant part of their locomotor repertoire. So they are saying that on the basis of the femur corroborates the bipedality inferred from the cranium, and they're saying that the ulnae show that this thing was still spending time in the trees. This is in stark contrast to the femoral analysis done by Macchiarelli and colleagues in this paper that you should hopefully see now, as I'm altering myself over here in size so you can see it, titled Nature and Relationships of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. These guys wrote their paper 2 years earlier, and there is drama with regard to that publication. Apparently, Macchiarelli's student, or Macchiarelli published this femur, their analysis of this femur. Students were involved, things like that, and Guy and colleagues were not pleased about that. Now, you should also notice that Bernard Wood is on this as well. Bernard Wood is a very sort of prolific paleoanthropologist. I disagree with him on some stuff, but he's awesome. These guys say a partial left femur, which was recovered in July 2001 at the Taurus Manala Formation, the same one we just talked about, the same femur, same location. They say that we are confident that the femoral shaft belongs to a hominid, and then they say it's probably most parsimonious to say it's Sahelanthropus tchadensis because that's the only primate at the site. And what they say is the results of their preliminary functional analysis suggest the TM266 femoral shaft belongs to an individual that was not habitually bipedal, something that should be taken into account when considering the relationship of Sahelanthropus tchadensis. The circumstances of its discovery should encourage researchers to check to see whether there is more postcranial evidence of Sahelanthropus tchadensis among the fossils recovered from Taurus Manala. So, what you should immediately be noticing is that this femur was discovered at the same time as the cranium was. So why did they take so long to publish it? Well, Guy and colleagues in the Daver paper that we just had up here, the main paper that we're going over, argue that it took that long to do the analysis and that also they were busy with other material. I don't know about that, but I'm also not a part of the crew, so I'm not going to say anything further. I'm just going to note that that's an awful long time to be analyzing a femur, and the ulnae, evidently. So let's take a look at the figures and see what they have to say. Okay, so unfortunately, I cannot actually walk you through the pictures within the paper itself. I have access to it through my institution, and you can see them open access, but they're little on the actual website. On Google Images, it blows them up a little bit and makes it easier, and I would rather just play it on the safe side of copyright these days, given that as the channel continues to grow, I garner more and more enemies. So this, as you can see, is the shaft of the femur. This is that itty bitty little femur that we have, and there's not much to it. It's the shaft. It is not containing the distal condyles or much of the proximal end, but there is a little bit. And if you're a layperson, you're going to look at this and you're going to go, yeah, it's a bone, like it is what it is. I guess it's bowed out a little bit, and we call this an antero-posterior bow. It's bent antero-posteriorly. But if you know anything about, osteology or human evolution, a couple of things stick out. First is this ridge of bone that runs along this sort of surface of the shaft here. This is called, in humans, a linea aspera, and it is a very important muscle attachment site for like a ton of different muscles that are important for bipedality and maintaining an upright posture. In hominins, we tend to call this, especially the earlier hominins, it's usually what's called a proto-linea aspera because it's a ridge which isn't present in things that aren't at least a little bit bipedal, but it's not as intense of the muscle attachment site. It's not as a defined ridge as it is in later hominins. It's very literally a transitional ridge, the proto-linea aspera. And here it is, present, very clearly sticking out like a sore thumb. This little section up here in B, which is highlighted, I guess, better in E, is what's called the gluteal tuberosity. The gluteal tuberosity is also a muscle attachment site, and it is a very important one because the gluteal tuberosity is the attachment site for the gluteus maximus, which is one of the most important muscles with regard to staying upright and moving, walking, running bipedally. The fact that they're arguing that it's present is really, really big, right? Also in the proximal portion of the femur, they argue in their CT scans, which you can see over here to the right, the presence of what's called a calcar femoral, which is basically just a little plate of compressed bone that helps distribute stress during loading. They also argue, more over there to the right, that the torsion or the twisting of the femur is incredibly human-like. And if you know anything about torsion, it is. They are actually right on that. So that's the main three traits from this unassuming femur that make it look hominin-like. The fact that we've got the proto-linea aspera, including the gluteal tuberosity, the fact that we have the calcar femoral, and the fact that the torsion looks hominin-like. There isn't torsion in a hominin fashion in chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangutans. So that's it. Those are the three main traits. They argue for some other aspects. The cortical bone we're going to show in just a second, they argue that that looks hominin-like. But as far as what the consensus in my department seems to be, those are the three characteristics that make it look like a hominin to the exclusion of the sort of chimpanzee or gorilla morph. Now, the overall shape is chimpish, right? It's got this bend to it. But the way that evolution works is that right after the human-chimpanzee split, the individuals on either side of that split, right after it occurs, should only have a handful of traits. Immediately after the split, there should be almost no differentiation at all. You literally couldn't pick them out of a lineup. But maybe a couple 100,000 years after, especially if there's pressure, there's going to be a handful of traits that would be, right, diagnosably hominin or diagnosably panin. This all depends, right, on what the last common ancestor of humans and chimps looked like, right? Because there are some that argue that the last common ancestor of humans and chimps was actually more similar to hominins than it was to panins, and that panins are maybe even a little bit more derived. So it's really going to depend on the status of that individual. But as it stands, these characteristics seem pretty limited to hominins. And when they're argued, one or two of them in the like their presence is argued in some of the Miocene apes, like Danuvius, for instance, there is a lot of pushback because it's even more slight. It's even more of a hint rather than like a full presence, which I think, especially in the Protolinea aspera here, is pretty obvious. Now, that's what we've got for the femur. Looking at the ulna, there is no controversy here. Everybody looks at this ulna and they're like, that looks like an orangutan ulna. Whoever these ulnae belong to was a careful clamberer up in the trees and was certainly arboreal. What you can know from this, though, is that Sahelanthropus tchadensis was not a knuckle walker. There's not a hint of that in the ulnae. So if anything, it's living, in the trees, probably most of the time, I would say, but we're going to get to that in just a second. Then we have the cortical bone distribution. So A, B, C, and D compare Sahelanthropus tchadensis, the far leftmost bone in each quadrant here, followed by humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangs. In A, I think that it's pretty clear that Sahelanthropus tchadensis looks most like the gorilla. It's got the heat map. This is like a heat map of cortical bone. And we're looking at a thickness that's most similar to gorillas on sort of the lateral portions of the bone. On B, to me, it looks most similar to a chimp, but certainly least similar to a human in B, in that view. The heat map is most similar to perhaps the orang in this one. In C, however, this thing looks most human-like here, right? The cortical bone distribution is most similar to humans to a human with this red stripe, probably a muscle attachment site, right along what to me is more of a layperson than the folks who specialize on this, more along the lines of this Protolinea aspera here. And D, we see that the similarity really doesn't match any of them. I would argue that it's probably somewhere in between human and orangutan here, but the cortical bone distribution with regard to the shaft seems pretty inconclusive to me. It looks like this thing is whatever it's doing with regard to this specific morphology is relatively unique, which, boy, isn't that kind of what you would expect from a generalized Miocene ape, from which the other specialized locomotor patterns of knuckle walking, suspensory clambering, and bipedalism come from? So this is a PCA of the subtrochanteric cross-sectional contours, just the aspects of the minutia of the bone along the shaft. And in both of these boxes here, PCA stands for principal component analysis. So, what does it look like, right? And when you plot it along, you get all these nice boxes, and the boxes form certain, where does Sahelanthropus fall out when you plot different hominins, australopiths, members of genus Homo, and extant apes. And this red box here is australopiths, and there's Sahelanthropus, that little star in the middle here, if you can see. There's the star. There's Sahelanthropus. It falls quite neatly with the australopiths here. And in our other PCA down here in B, here's Sahelanthropus falling just out of the range for early Homo, but certainly closest to early Homo than anything else. So the point being on this little diagram here is that, oh shoot, you couldn't see it because I zoomed in. That's what I was checking just now. There, now you can see it a little bit better. This is just showing that Sahelanthropus tchadensis, again, is appearing to be most similar with the hominins and is making Guy and Davers' case here that it's hominin-like, right, with regard to this. There is an additional graph, I guess you would say, that I would love to show you, but it's in the extended data and it doesn't show up on Google Images. So check out the Science Hub if you want to see that, or check it out through your institution. And this chart, this graph, is a little bit sus to me. It was pointed out to me by other members of my department, and they're right. Basically, they're looking at the curvature of the femur, and the authors of the paper make a case that even the curvature looks more hominin-like, but Sahelanthropus tchadensis falling out with the hominins is dictated by, the hominin encompassing little shape, if you will, is determined by Sahelanthropus tchadensis. So, if Sahelanthropus tchadensis is helping create the shape for the hominins, of course it's going to fall out with the hominins. That was a little bit weird. Check that out if you like, but I do not think that impacts the presence of the calcar femoral, the gluteal tuberosity, the protolinea aspera, or that cortical bone distribution and the torsion, all of which I think just barely nudge Sahelanthropus tchadensis more into the hominin line than just being sort of another Miocene ape. So is Sahelanthropus tchadensis a biped, or a habitual biped at least, as Daver and colleagues argue? I don't know that I would go that far. I think certainly Sahelanthropus tchadensis looks more bipedal than anything that came prior to it, any of the other Miocene apes. And this is mainly because of, I hate to say it, but the cranial material. This is the best case, I think, for something that is bipedal, mainly because of this anterior foramen magnum. And the consensus seems to be, at least as far as I can tell, that the reconstruction is correct and that anterior foramen magnum really is forward, like in something that is upright. Now, that provides some excellent support for the upright posture. What about the actual bipedalism itself? I think the femur ever so slightly helps that case, and I think in conjunction with the ulnae, we're basically painting this picture of a critter that spends a lot of time in the trees. It's still moving around arboreally, but it's moving around arboreally upright, like with an upright posture, which is an excellent predisposition for something that's going to be bipedal later. I do think Sahelanthropus tchadensis was, again, probably moving bipedally more than anything else that came prior, primarily due to those small, minute aspects of the femur that nudge it towards spending some time upright, either in the trees or on the ground, but at least with regard to those muscle attachment sites, it does seem to be hinting towards some terrestrial bipedality. Habitual is a strong word. That implies that this thing is doing this frequently. I don't know how frequently it's doing it, but I do think that what Guy et al., or yes, Daver et al., but Guy is involved, published, does not negate something that is bipedal when it comes down to the ground. And I think that what Macchiarelli and colleagues published can also be true. I wish that Daver and his colleagues had actually covered Macchiarelli's analysis. They didn't. I really wish we would see more communication there, but it does seem that the overall picture for Sahelanthropus tchadensis supports something that is in fact a hominin on the basis of those scant few potentially bipedal indications, but also the reduced canines, the nature of the nuchal plane, the reduced prognathism, etc. I think it's a hominin. I think it was sometimes bipedal, not quite habitual. I think they definitely overstated their case, at least in my opinion, but this is a really nice step towards understanding more about how bipedalism came about and perhaps what the last common ancestor of humans and chimps was like. There's a tantalizing possibility here because Sahelanthropus tchadensis is dated, and at least on the biogeography and the sort of assemblage of animals that it is found with, fairly confidently around 7 million years ago. This is the date for the split between humans and chimpanzees. What if Sahelanthropus tchadensis isn't on the hominin side, but that the last common ancestor of humans and chimps just looked more like a hominin than it did like a chimpanzee or another general Miocene ape? What if chimpanzees are actually more derived than humans with regard to their more posterior foramen magnum and acquisition of knuckle walking? Because we know that the type of knuckle walking that chimpanzees and gorillas do is different. So who is to say that the last common ancestor between hominins and panins wasn't just a little bit more like hominins than it was like panins? And then Sahelanthropus tchadensis might not be a hominin. It might be the common ancestor of hominins and panins, and those bipedal characteristics were simply lost in the panin lineage. It's an interesting thought. I don't think that there is nearly enough to say that this is the case. I still lean on the side of this thing being a hominin, but as we continue to find out more and pull more up from the Taurus Manala formation out in Chad, I do hope we get more answers. Just right before we go, I want to touch a little bit on the type of data that we would need to show that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is not a sometimes bipedal but primarily arboreal early hominin. To show that this thing is quote-unquote just another Miocene ape, you're going to need two things. First, you're going to need to invalidate the reconstruction of the skull. You need to show that that thing is incorrect and that the foramen magnum is at least a little bit more posterior than it's currently shown, because that thing is pretty compelling with regard to the orthograde posture. And the second thing that you need to do is show that all of the traits that lean towards at least a little bit of bipedality in Sahelanthropus tchadensis' femur, so things like the gluteal tuberosity, the protolinea aspera, the torsion. You would need to show that all of these characteristics can be found in earlier Miocene apes, that this is not derived for Sahelanthropus tchadensis. And if you could do both of those things, I think that you can make a pretty good case that it's not a hominin, but you're going to need to do that first. So until next time, my gentle and of course very modern apes, please do take care of yourselves.